Hi, educational purposes, fair use. Said only that applies to the person. I'm not a person, I'm a man. I'm an individual. Stand on my own 2 feet, like everyone else should be doing. Don't be getting into groups and that, which can be infiltrated and pushed down certain ways and stuff like that. You know what I mean? They're going to be destroyed and stuff. Types of strawman arguments. There are countless ways to distort an opposing view when using a straw man. Common ways to do so include oversimplifying, generalizing, or exaggerating the opponent's argument. Focusing on only a few specific aspects of an opponent's argument. Quoting parts of the opponent's argument out of context. We get all this a lot from the Globe Earth commenters. Arguing against fringe or extreme opinions, which are sometimes used in order to support the opponent's stance, but which the opponent didn't actually use. You get that a lot and all. I don't represent any maps or models or any of this fucking 3,000 mile high sun or any of that bullshit. Yeah? But people are like, because it's all propaganda and strawman fallacy bullshit basically, all these maps and models and everything that are out there. Right? But you get these people coming along going, using that against you, and you're like, well, I don't represent any of that. I've never claimed any of that. So that's got fuck all to do with me. Yeah, it's got nothing to do with me, that, at all. Yeah? So stop arguing against fringe or extreme opinions, which are sometimes used in order to support the opponent's stance, but which the opponent didn't actually use. I don't use any of that stuff. So stop bringing it to me. Yeah? In addition, there are various other ways in which people create strawman arguments, which can be as minor as changing small details in their opponent's original statement, or as major as completely fabricating claims that their opponent has never made in the first place. However, all of these techniques share one thing in common. They all involve someone distorting the opposing stance in order to make it easier to attack. As such, strawman arguments are relatively simple to recognise in discourse. Essentially, when you realise that there is a mismatch between someone's stance and the stance that their opponent is attacking, it's a clear sign that a strawman is being used. Nevertheless, in practice it can be sometimes difficult to notice or to be sure whether this type of argument has been used, especially if the individual who is using the strawman knows what they are doing. How to counter a strawman. A good way to minimise your vulnerability to strawman arguments in the first place is to use clear and definitive language. Define your terms, define what you mean, yeah? First principles and all that lot. And if the people that you're talking to are not going to define the terms, define the language, and they're not going to, agree on first principles, there's no need continuing, because you're just going to be talking past each other. With as little room for misinterpretation as possible. This makes it more difficult for your opponent to distort your stance, and makes it easier for you to correct them if they attempt to do so. However, while this reduces the risk of someone using a strawman against you, nothing can prevent someone from using this type of argument if they truly want to. So it's important to know how to respond to the use of a strawman argument. In general, there are 3 main strategies you can use. Point out the strawman. Call out your opponent on their use of the strawman by explaining why their argument is fallacious and how it distorts your original stance, or even a stance that you don't even hold. Because if you think other people hold it, then you must hold it, because it's guilt by association fallacy that they use. Yeah? You can put them on the defensive by asking them to justify why they believe that the distorted stance that they present is the same as the one that you originally proposed. Since the two are different, your opponent will either be forced to admit that their argument was invalid, or they will try to justify it by using even more fallacious reasoning, which you can then attack. More than likely, they don't admit that their argument was invalid when they use a straw man. They're going to use more fallacious reasoning, like red herring fallacy, ad hominem attack, argumentum ad hominem fallacy, name calling fallacy, which is another variation of the ad hominem fallacy. And if they can't get away with that, they use other fallacious reasoning as well. Ignore the straw man. You can choose to ignore the distorted version of your argument that your opponent presents, i.e. the straw man, and continue to advocate to your original position. This can be effective in some cases, but if they continue to focus on the straw man, you may have to use one of the two other techniques mentioned here. In order to ensure that the discussion progresses, and in order to avoid giving the impression that you're incapable of addressing your opponent's argument. Well, no, I just point out it's a straw man and say, why are you being fallacious? You know what I mean? That's not what I said, or that's not what we were talking about, or whatever. Or you're avoiding the issue fallacy. They use that one a lot and all. When you bring up them being fallacious, they try and turn it back on you and say you're being fallacious and stuff like that. When it's them that's really being fallacious. Accept the straw man. I wouldn't recommend that, to be honest. I wouldn't accept it. I'd be like, no, that's not me. I don't represent that. That's not what I said. So basically, no. Do one. I'll read it anyway, but I don't recommend this myself. But it's up to you. Do what you want. In some cases, it might be necessary or preferable for you to accept a straw man when you are defending your stance, meaning that instead of arguing in favour of your original stance, you could start defending the distorted version of your stance, as presented by your opponent. Keep in mind, however, that the longer you go down this route, the more difficult it will be to go back and point out your opponent's fallacious reasoning, since by defending the argument presented in the straw man, you appear to accept it as your own stance. See, that's why you should never accept the straw man and say, oh, right, okay, and start arguing against the straw man. Because, like it says there, you mean, it'll appear that you accept it as your stance and stuff like that, but you don't, because you didn't say that in the first place, because of the hasty generalisation fallacy. Not hasty generalisation, sorry, wrong one. Guilt by association fallacy. Yeah, not hasty generalisation. There is hasty generalisation there with it all and all, but it's more guilt by association fallacy. Overall, since a strawman argument is fallacious because it distorts the stance that it argues against, the correct way to counter it from a purely logical perspective is to point out this distortion. This is also the most effective choice for countering the strawman in most cases, but there are some situations where it is better to use an alternative approach by either ignoring the strawman or accepting it. I don't think you should accept it at all, to be honest. I think you should point it out every time. I wouldn't ignore it either, because if you ignore it, then they're just going to go, oh, you're running away, you coward, you know what I mean? And they're going to start like that, you know what I mean? Start saying, well, you don't know then, or you ain't got an answer, or whatever else, you know what I mean? All that lot. And you're like, no, I'm not answering it because it's a straw man. You know what I mean? Just tell them, no, I'm not answering that question. I don't answer logically fallacious questions or arguments. Just point out the fallacies. Best way. Like I said, then they get triggered then and they start saying, oh, well, turning it back on you, calling you a paid troll when it's actually them that's the paid troll. And that's a typical thing that paid trolls do. If they get found out, they turn it on you. Say, oh, well, you sound like a paid troll and stuff like that because you found them out to be a paid troll. Yeah? So they turn that on you then to try and shift the what they call it, shifting the, what's the word I'm looking for? Shifting the object away from them, you know what I mean? Saying, well, no, it's not me, you're the paid troll, like that, you know what I mean? So people then forget about they've been called out as a paid troll and start focusing on them calling you a paid troll. You know what I mean? The big book fallacy. Yeah, but you're a paid troll. The big book fallacy. We're going to do the next bit in accounting for an audience. Thank you.